This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Kaldheim there right now if you click on my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today I'm continuing with my Kaldheim limited set review. So far I've given my thoughts on all the white and blue cards in the set, and today we're continuing with black. In this video, I'll evaluate every mono-black card in Kaldheim for the limited format. I end my discussion of each of these cards by giving them a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find an explanation of the grades in the description below. Keep in mind that in this video, I'm only talking about the limited formats, that's draft and sealed, and I'm not discussing other formats. Also keep in mind that these are my evaluations of cards before actually having played the format. So, of course, I'm not going to be right about everything, though one thing to keep in mind is that usually when I'm wrong, I underrate a card instead of overrating it. Alright, let's look at our first black card. First, it's Blood on the Snow, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a rare snow sorcery, and it says choose one. Destroy all creatures, or destroy all planeswalkers. Then return a creature or planeswalker card with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast this spell. So if you have snow mana around when you cast this, it's going to feel great. Do keep in mind that unlike most basic lands, you cannot put snow-covered lands into your deck after the draft. You're going to have to draft them for them to be in your deck. So even without snow mana, this is a board sweeper, which is a powerful, irreplaceable effect. Sure, some decks might not love to run it if they're the beatdown, but having a card in your deck that just completely reshapes the board is worthwhile pretty much everywhere. There aren't very many cards that can change a game so drastically. Now, one of the downsides of board sweepers, especially a 6-mana one, is that your opponent likely gets to add to the board first. But the snow upside here helps make that less of an issue, since you get to reanimate something. Even with just 2 snow mana here, you're going to be in really good shape, and that isn't a crazy thing to have by the time you have 6 mana. I think that makes this very close to a bomb. If it always gave you back a creature from your graveyard, it probably would be. But I do think the snow requirement is a big enough thing here that it is held to a B+. Next up, it's Sky Berserker, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 human berserker at uncommon, and it says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Sky Berserker. It gains menace until end of turn. This seems pretty strong to me. Even if we take Foretell out of the equation, and it does matter because it will make it easier to double spell at will in this format, but even if we ignore that, this would be a pretty nice card. Just triggering the ability once will be enough to feel like your investment was worth it, and if you do it more than that, this Berserker will get silly in a hurry. You won't always be able to double spell, but you'll be able to often enough that this is a very real threat despite only being a 2-drop. I mean, if on turn 4 you play this and then another 2-drop, that's a pretty darn good turn 4, even if you don't get to take advantage of the menace part. So yeah, this card, like a lot of black-white cards in this set, incentivizes having a low curve and or a lot of Foretell. Now, he does start out very vulnerable, and there will be times where you can't get him going or he dies to a 1-mana removal spell, but that's fine. I think the risk is worth it, and I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Burning Rune Demon, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 demon berserker at mythic rare. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them. Put the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. So a 6-mana 6/6 flyer is usually at least a B or B-, and Burning Rune Demon will also draw you a card, and it's generally going to be a pretty good one. Sure, your opponent will put the best one in the graveyard, but getting a huge evasive creature and what is probably the second best card left in your deck is a very good deal, and means this demon is a 2-for-1. In addition to all of that, if your opponent can't kill it, he represents a very real threat. And the fact that he does something, even if he dies right away, is really nice. Between the huge body Burning Rune Demon has, plus the flying, and whatever your second best card is in your deck, you're getting a really good value out of 6 mana, and I think this is enough to be in the lower range of a bomb, I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Crippling Fear, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says choose a creature type. Creatures that aren't of the chosen type get -3/-3 until end of turn. This format is a tribal one, with each color pair having an overwhelming number of creatures that have the same creature type. Sure, sometimes you'll line up against someone in your same color pair and it will be a bit awkward there, and it also can't kill changelings, which is also a little bit awkward, but this also has the upside of being a one-sided or close to one-sided board sweeper, and that's no joke at all. There's also the downside that even if you're in a color pair, typically not all the creatures in your deck will have the same creature type, but again, that's where changeling has upside here, because all of your changelings will survive this. In the end, I think you'll be able to get close enough to this being a one-sided board wipe often enough that it's a high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Drana Berserker, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 elf berserker at common, and when it dies, if its power was 3 or greater, you create a 2/2 black zombie berserker creature token. This seems alright as a 2-mana 2/2 with some decent upside. If you can get a zombie out of it when it dies, you're going to feel pretty good, and doing that isn't a pipe dream. There are equipment, auras, tricks, and +1/+1 counters in this set, among other things, and you generally just need one of those things to get the death trigger to happen. Now, you shouldn't expect to be able to make it happen all the time either, but the reasonable floor on this coupled with the nice upside is enough for this to be a solid common. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Demonic Gifts, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. This type of trick is usually a pretty solid inclusion, although I definitely prefer when it only costs 1 mana. At the same time, when we've seen this at 1 mana, the creature does come back tapped, and this doesn't, so that will matter sometimes. The stats boost is enough to make your creature take down larger creatures in combat, and it doesn't really have to win the combat straight up, since the gifts will bring your creature right back if it dies. Now, you do generally want to at least be trading, but the good news is you are happy to trade in this case because your creature will come back, and this can get especially nasty if your creature has an Into the Battlefield ability. It also doesn't hurt that it does something against most removal spells too, and it pairs nicely with Drana Berserker, who we just saw. I think the first copy of this will make it into most black decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Dogged Pursuit, which for 3 generic and a black is a common enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is not unlike Ill-Gotten Inheritance, a card from the recent past that I was really wrong about in my set review. The basic effect of this card is the same, though the Inheritance also had an expensive activated ability that allowed you to drain 4 in the late game, and this doesn't. But I think this will probably still be a little better than it looks. Draining 1 life gives you inevitability, and because it's also gaining you life, it helps you to survive longer, which in turn helps you drain even more life. If you are a control deck, this seems like a decent win condition to me. Now, tapping out to play this on turn 4 will not always be smart because you need to be building your board in the early game to, not die, and that is a pretty significant downside, but I do think you'll play this often enough that it gets a C-. It will be interesting to see if I underrate this one too. For reference, I gave Ill-Gotten Inheritance a D-, and it ended up being at least a C in that format, so we'll see what happens here. Next up, it's draugr Necromancer, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/4 snow creature, zombie cleric at rare. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, you exile that card with an ice counter on it instead. And it says you may cast spells from among cards in exile, your opponent's own, with ice counters on them, and you may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. This seems pretty good. A vanilla 4-mana 4/4 is probably a C, and this guy is far from vanilla. Just making your opponent's creatures that die go to exile is a somewhat relevant ability. Most decks have at least 1 to 2 cards that care about the graveyard in some way, so that is upside. But where you really get the value is out of the ability to cast the creatures that are exiled by the necromancer. Now, you do have to have snow mana to cast creatures that aren't in a color that lands you control could produce, but that isn't a huge ask. You generally will just need 1 or 2 snow lands to make that work in most cases. And then, of course, there's the fact that a decent chunk of opponents will have creatures you can cast with your mana anyway. Now, the snow limitation is relevant, and there will be times where this guy is just too slow to help you out, but I think he's pretty good and going to be a card you can take over most other cards in the set. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's draugr Recruiter, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 zombie cleric at common. It has Boast, and you can pay 3 generic and a black to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And this is the first time we're seeing Boast in this video, so I'll remind you how it works. It's an activated ability you can only activate once a turn, and only if your creature with Boast has attacked that turn. So this is a Boast ability that is all about the late game. The Boast is expensive and also asks for cards in the graveyard, but if you do get to use this late and attack with the Recruiter in a situation where the best your opponent can do is trade with it or chump block it, it's going to feel pretty nice. That said, by the late game, a 4-mana 3/3 won't always be capable of making that situation happen. Sometimes, if you have something good enough in your graveyard, it will be worth a bad attack, but it is still kind of a rough deal. I think I will probably cut this a little more than I will play it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Draugur's Helm, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 generic and a black, and if you do, you create a 2/2 black zombie berserker creature token, and then you attach Draugur's Helm to it, and the Helm gives equipped creature +2/+2, and it gives it menace, and it has an equip cost of 4 generic mana. So, as just an equipment, this doesn't seem very good. 2 to play and 4 to equip for +2/+2 and menace is just too much mana, especially the equip part. The good news, though, is that this normally won't just be the equipment. If you pay 5 for it, you get a 2/2 zombie token that is equipped with this, which means 5 for a 4/4 with menace. That's a decent rate, especially because if the token does die, you still have the equipment, and that just makes this upside on a creature. This is something most black decks will play the first copy of, and you should take it sort of highly. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Dreadrider, which for 5 generic and a black is a 3/7 Spirit Knight at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and tap it to exile a creature card from your graveyard. Target opponent loses 3 life. I kind of like this card. This isn't to say that it's good, but I can see myself running one of these as a decent win condition and really slow controlling black decks. It doesn't have great stats, but they are the kind of stats that make it really hard for your opponent to effectively attack through, and also the kind of stats that limit the number of removal spells that will actually work on it. This late game mana sink turns a full graveyard into some pretty significant value. Making an opponent lose 3 every turn is a pretty good fail case, and gives you something to do even if you're flooding, and will put serious pressure on your opponent in the late game. All that said, it isn't exactly efficient, but it will be a reasonable card for some control decks out there. You basically will never play it in an aggressive deck, obviously enough, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Dream Devourer, which for 1 generic and a black is a 0/3 demon cleric at rare, and each non-land card in your hand without foretell has foretell, and its foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2, and whenever you foretell a card, Dream Devourer gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So with Foretell, you can play 2 generic mana to exile a card from your hand, and then on a later turn, you can cast that card for its Foretell cost. Well, this is a neat design, but also one that I think is kind of hard to evaluate. Obviously, a 2-mana 0/3 isn't so good, but making it so you can foretell all your cards isn't bad, especially since it basically guarantees you'll never pay more than its mana cost to foretell it, so you can just get the upside of being able to pay for things in installments. I think most of the time this will cause serious problems for opponents, in addition to helping make it easier for you to cast cards, and that's a lot of nice stuff to have on a 2-drop. The real question is, how good of a job can you really do pumping its power? I sort of think that it will be challenging to keep it really scary forever, because eventually you'll run out of cards, but still, I think the upside here is pretty nice, and you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. This is a weird one where I wouldn't be surprised if I was wrong one way or another. Probably need to play this format some and get more of a feel for Foretell before it's easier to figure out what's going on here. Next up, it's Dusk Wielder, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 Elf Berserker at common, and it has Boast, where you can pay 1 generic mana, and target opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. I don't like this a ton. It's a 1 mana 1/2, so it just won't be able to attack very often, and most of the card's value comes from Boast. Even if you do play it early and it attacks a couple times, you're probably not going to be able to play the Boast ability because you'll want to play like, a 2-drop and a 3-drop. Although at least this Boast ability is cheap. I think this would probably be like a D+ in most formats, but this does have synergy with a bunch of different decks. It's an elf, which black-green cares about. It has Boast and is kind of an aggressive 1-drop, which black-red cares about. And it's a cheap spell, which black-white cares about. I think all of that saves this from the D range and means you'll play it often enough for it to be a C-. Next up, it's Egon, God of Death, who for 2 generic and a black mana is a 6/6 legendary god at rare. It has Death Touch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, sacrifice Egon and draw a card. And like all the gods in this set, it's a modal double-face card, which means on the other side of the card, there's a different card, and these modal double-face cards do not transform. You choose which one you want to cast, and then you cast it, and it stays that way for as long as it's in play. And the other side here is Throne of Death, which for 1 black mana is a legendary artifact at rare, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and tap it to exile a creature card from your graveyard and draw a card. So this is a part of a cycle of gods in this set, all of which have pretty innovative designs, but I think this one might be the most innovative. Both sides of this card really want you to have cards in your graveyard. On the egon side, you need to have 2 cards to exile, or it sacrifices itself and draws you a card. The nice thing about that is, even if you can't quite keep egon in play, it will be on the board for a whole turn, and a 6/6 death touch is no joke as a blocker. Then when your turn comes, he replaces himself. So the fail case here, if you can't quite keep egon in play, is not that miserable. The other side of the card, Throne of Death, is a pretty sweet little graveyard engine. It mills a card every turn, and presumably you'll get creatures in your graveyard from that effect, and then in the later part of the game, it can cash in creatures in the graveyard for cards. There's a decent amount of graveyard stuff in this set, and that will make both sides of this card pretty happy. Now, both do need some considerable setup to really be at their best, but I think they're both good enough, even in a fail case, that you're willing to take this card with a first pick most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Elder Fang Disciple, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 elf cleric at common, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Ravenous Rats is an old favorite card of mine, and that's basically what this is. A 2-mana 1/1 that makes an opponent discard a card is nice, and because it does that, you're at least starting out with a 1-for-1 in most cases. Then if it can trade for an X1, you're getting some serious 2-for-1 value out of a 2-drop. Now, it won't always line up that way, or even usually line up that way, and in the late game, the discard thing might not matter too much, but it makes up for that by having the elf creature type, which matters in this set. Still, this is a card you'll be cutting a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Eradicator Valkyrie, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/3 Angel Berserker at Mythic Rare. It has flying and lifelink as well as hexproof from Planeswalkers. And it has Boast for 1 generic and a black, and you can sacrifice a creature, and each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Well, this is really, really, really good, like bomb level good. A 4-mana 4/3 with lifelink and flying is probably a B at worst, and I think I would argue for B+. Evasiveness and lifelink together is a great way to win a race, and that's often what you're trying to do in Limited. The life point gap between players created by this creature every time it hits an opponent is 8, and that's no joke. Then you throw in the Boast ability, which allows you to give up a creature to make your opponent sacrifice a creature, and you suddenly have a 4-mana 4/3 with lifelink and flying that also works as removal. And sure, sometimes that effect won't matter because you want to have a creature you want to give up, or maybe your opponent's board is still too wide, but it will do something more often than it won't, and it's stapled onto a highly efficient creature anyway. Oh, it also has hexproof from Planeswalkers, which might come up on super rare occasions in Limited, so that doesn't hurt either. But yeah, this is an easy first pick. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Feed the Serpent, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common instant, and it says, exile target creature or planeswalker. This is premium removal. 4 mana to exile creatures or planeswalkers is great. This common can deal with pretty much all problematic creatures in the format, and it can do it at instant speed, increasing your chances of getting a 2-for-1. In the end, Feed the Serpent is probably black's best common in the set. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Grim Draugr, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 snow creature. It's a zombie berserker at common, and you can pay 1 generic and 1 snow mana, and it gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. We've seen almost this exact card before. Kozilek's Shrieker was a very similar card to this. Both utilize special mana from the set that you have to draft. Both are 3 mana 3/2s, and both gain +1/+0 and menace. The Draugr is a little bit worse in that you need 2 mana to use its ability. Overall, the Shrieker was not much more than just a solid card, and I don't see the Draugr doing much better than that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Hailstorm Valkyrie, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 snow creature, Angel Wizard at uncommon. It has flying and trample, and you can pay 2 snow mana to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. So this card's basic stats aren't very impressive. 4 mana 2/2 with flying and trample is probably something like a D+ at best. That's just not very efficient, and having trample on a creature like that isn't going to make a difference. But by adding the ability to pump snow mana into this, you certainly get a better card. Oftentimes your opponent will just have to take a hit from this because of the threat of activation of that ability. That said, being able to do it more than once a turn in this format is going to be challenging. 2 snow mana sources will be possible, but expecting to have more than that with regularity is a bit of a stretch, and even getting 2 out is far from a guarantee. Still, this is sort of a reasonable card in the early game, and then in the late game, as you amass more snow mana, it may become more and more of a problem for your opponent. And I think in a deck that has a reasonable number of snow sources, you'll always play this, and it'll be a pretty nice card, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Haunting Voyage, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says choose a creature type. Return up to 2 creature cards of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was foretold, return all creatures of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield instead. and it has foretell for 5 generic and 2 black. So this is kind of a cool version of Patriarch's Bidding. If the game goes long and you're in a tribal deck, this will basically end the game on the spot when you foretell it. Additionally, even if you don't foretell it, in the late game it will still be a pretty strong play that gets you back 2 creatures. It does ask for some setup, but tribal is pretty strong in this set, so I have a hard time imagining you won't be able to get 2 things more often than not when you just cast it normally. It is worth noting that it's one of the few cards in the set that has a higher foretell cost than regular casting cost, so in the end, you pay a total of 9 mana to reanimate all your creatures with the same type, and that's not exactly a great deal, but the nice news is you pay it over 2 turns, and 7 mana is a reasonable amount to have, at least considerably more reasonable than 9. It does require the game to be pretty late to get going and a little bit of building around, and that definitely holds it back, but I'm going to start the format by taking it pretty highly, especially in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Infernal Pet, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 creature imp at common, and it says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Infernal Pet, and it gains flying until end of turn. So even triggering this one time is going to give you pretty good value for your mana, and if you can continue to double spell throughout the game, Infernal Pet is just going to get bigger, and gaining flying until end of turn will mean that it can usually still attack your opponent. It does start out small and fragile, but I do think Infernal Pet is one of the key commons for the black-white double spell deck. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Yarl of the Forsaken, which for 3 generic and a black is a common zombie cleric. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn, and it has foretell for 1 generic and a black. So this type of effect is often underwhelming, and if this were only ever a 4 mana 3/2 with that effect, it would probably be a C- at the very, very best. Sure, when you do manage to trigger the effect, it feels pretty good, but most of the time, you had to give up a card to make that effect work in the first place, so it isn't quite as good of a deal as it might seem at first. You do sometimes get to use it when you don't give up a card, but you give up a card more often than not. Now, adding foretell here does matter because it means it will be easier to find a window where you can actually cast and use this, as spending 2 mana on the turn you actually cast the card is much, much better. And it's also important that it has flash, which gives you even more of a chance to find an ideal time to play this. This is, of course, a situational removal spell of sorts, but it will be set up reasonably a lot of the time. And even if you have to give up a creature for it, the efficiency here that you can get, plus, flash really messing things up for your opponent, makes this a pretty good card, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Carfell Kennel Master, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 zombie berserker, and when it enters the battlefield, up to 2 target creatures each get +1/+0 and gain indestructible until end of turn. So we've seen cards pretty similar to this, but normally they give one thing a power boost and indestructible, and I think giving it to 2 things is a little bit better. Chances are good that it will enable at least 1 creature to attack who couldn't before. That said, there are board states where its enter the battlefield ability is pretty much meaningless, and in those cases, a 5 mana 4/4 won't feel too good. I think you feel fine about the first copy of this, but you probably don't want to go beyond that. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Comas Faithful, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 elf cleric at common. It has lifelink, and when it dies, each player mills 3 cards. This seems solid. A 3 mana 3/1 with lifelink isn't terrible. Trading for an X3 and gaining 3 life in the process isn't bad, and it comes with some additional upside. Mostly, I think that upside will be useful for loading up your graveyard, and less useful if you're trying to straight up mill your opponent out with it, and it's also an elf, and that definitely matters. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Poison the Cup, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature. If this spell is foretold, scry 2, and it has foretell for 1 generic and a black. This is an excellent removal spell. I mean, it's strictly better than Murder, and Murder is already a premium removal spell and sort of the paragon of excellent black removal in Limited. 3 to kill anything is just an amazing deal, especially at instant speed. You do end up paying 1 more mana for it if you go the foretell route, but it also lets you pay it in installments, which is sometimes worthwhile, and of course, it also adds Scry 2 to the mix, which is probably worth that additional mana anyway. This is probably the best uncommon in the whole set. You'll even take it over most rares. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Priest of the Haunted Edge, which for 1 generic and a black is a 0/4 snow creature. It's a zombie cleric at common. And it says tap and sacrifice Priest of the Haunted Edge. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of snowlands you control. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Obviously enough, you're not playing this unless you end up with a significant number of snowlands, since a 2 mana 0/4 is pretty bad. and I'm skeptical it will be easy enough to get enough snow lands to really make this thing worthwhile. I mean, even if you do draft like 5, which is going to be a pretty good number, this still won't be able to get going often enough. I mean, if you can get it to do -1/-1 consistently, it's maybe a C-. And I guess if you have 5 snow lands, your chances are kind of reasonable of getting up to -2/-2, which will make this thing a little more interesting. But it still takes significant setup. It won't really do anything meaningful until the later part of the game. And even when it can do something, it's not going to be that impressive. I think it'll be too hard to make this work consistently, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Raise the Draugr, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says choose 1, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or return 2 target creature cards that share a creature type from your graveyard to your hand. Black always gets a common removal spell that lets you return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and here is the Kaldheim version of that. Cards in the past with similar effects are basically always something you want to run a single copy of, because they give your deck some late game punch and allow you to get extra uses out of the best creatures in your deck, which is pretty awesome. You don't usually want more of this type of card because they're so useless early, but that first copy is something you're always going to want. I think this one is particularly nice because it's an instant. We normally see this effect at sorcery speed, and sure, it asks for a little bit of help to get going. You really only want to play this if you're consistently getting the 2 creatures back. Just getting 1 is not a great deal. But with that in mind, I think your typical black deck in the format will have enough creatures that share creature types that this will get 2 things back by the mid to late game most of the time. So, like pretty much every version of this card we see, I think this is a C. Next up, it's Return Upon the Tide, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If it's an elf, create 2 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens, and it has Foretell for 3 generic and a black. So, most of the time, if you are reanimating an elf with this, you're probably not getting the largest creature, probably a 3/3 at the most. So it is nice that if you do go for an elf, you get those tokens, which will make the 5 mana investment a little less of a burden. Then, if you reanimate something big, you won't get the tokens, but you're probably still getting your 5 mana's worth. So basically, if you're in an elf deck at least, Return Upon the Tide helps you get around the downside of 5 mana reanimation spells by giving you a wider variety of options that will feel like you're doing an okay job with the card. It also has Foretell, which means that you can pay for it in installments, though with this one, you do end up paying 1 additional mana if you go that route, but that is sometimes worth doing. This set does have some significant graveyard sub-themes, especially in black-green, which is also an elf deck, so I think this seems like a nice uncommon, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Rise of the Dreadmarn, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare instant, and it says create X 2/2 black zombie berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn, and it has Foretell for 1 black mana. This kind of card is often awkward. It's just hard to manufacture the necessary turn for this to do a whole bunch. You can use it pretty reasonably if you can get 2 zombies out of it, but you'd be surprised how often combat doesn't exactly go the way you want it to, and making that happen is harder than it sounds. That said, this is more efficient than most versions of this we've seen, even if you just cast it normally, so it is a reasonable card even without Foretell. However, adding Foretell here is a big deal because it will allow you to find that narrow window a little more easily. Only having to pay 1 black for it means it will be easier to use in an advantageous situation. I think it is likely going to be most effective when you're the one blocking, since you have far more control over how combat goes as the blocker. And yeah, sometimes there will be board states where this gives you like 10 zombies and those will be amazing, but I think you have to imagine that getting 2 to 3 is the norm, but that's still pretty good. I'm a little skeptical about this card, but I think I want to start the format with it as a pretty high card in my pick order. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rune of Mortality, which for 1 generic and a black is an enchantment or a rune at uncommon. It has enchant permanent. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it has death touch, and as long as enchanted permanent is an equipment, it has equipped creature, has death touch. As I've already said about the white and blue runes, I like this cycle. Adding draw a card to an aura goes a long way towards making an aura better, since it can take away a 2-for-1. The fact that these can go on any permanent means that sometimes you can effectively cycle them too by putting them on a land if you're mana screwed. Death Touch is a nice keyword ability to grant too, because it can make any creature capable of trading with any other creature, and since you drew a card off of this, a trade will feel fine. I think this is a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Scamfar Avenger, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 elf berserker at rare, and whenever another non-token elf or berserker you control dies, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This seems pretty good to me. A 2-mana 3/1 is usually a borderline playable, and the Avenger here brings a very powerful ability along for the ride. Sure, you need elves and berserkers to get it going, but that's not going to be too hard in black, as we've already seen in this video. This trading 1 for 1 is kind of your worst case scenario, and that's not too bad for a 2-drop. If you just draw one card off of this, you're going to be in business, and you'll often be able to do more. Making opponents decide whether it's worth attacking you or blocking your creatures when you have this in play is a good thing. I think you can first pick this most of the time when you see it. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's scamfar Shadow Sage, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/5 elf cleric and uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. Each opponent loses X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common, or you gain X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common. This set has a lot of tribal stuff going on, and scamfar Shadow Sage is pretty happy about that. Obviously, it will work well in elf decks, but it will also be good in decks with several changelings, and, any black deck that has significant tribal stuff going on. It is even splashable in a tribal deck that doesn't have any black in it, so that's something to keep in mind. This seems like a card that you will groan about a lot when you see it, because it will frequently either allow a deck to claw their way back by gaining the person who casts it 3 to 4 life, or it will finish someone off by doing the last few points of damage out of nowhere. It doesn't even have the worst stats for 4 mana, as a 2/5 is a decent-ish defensive body. All that said, I do think the setup for this is significant enough that you don't want to be first picking it. I'm giving it a C+. That said, this does really feel like a card I could be wrong on, and I think if I am, I'm probably underrating it, and I guess we'll find out soon. Next up, it's Skull Raid, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent discards 2 cards. If fewer than 2 cards were discarded this way, you draw cards equal to the difference, and it has foretell for 1 generic and a black. This is an innovative way to design a mind rot effect. They could have just slapped foretell on it and called it a new card, but they went further than that, and I like what they did. Mind rot effects are often not great in limited. In the early game, you can get a 2 for 1 with them, but it comes at the great sacrifice of not adding to the board at all on turn 3. Then in the late game, it tends to get worse, because your opponents will have fewer cards that are relevant in their hand, and it's a terrible draw in the really late game. I usually give them like a D+. This card gets around those problems by becoming a draw spell if your opponent doesn't have 2 cards to discard, so that means that this Mind Rot has all the upside of most of them. It can get you a 2 for 1 early, but it can still do it if your opponent has 1 or no cards in the hand. Now, it isn't exactly an efficient draw spell, but that's okay with me overall. Foretell, of course, also makes it easier to cast because you get to pay in installments. That might all sound like I'm super high on this card, and I am, as far as Mind Rots go, but it's still just a C. The first copy seems like a solid inclusion in most black decks. Next up, it's Tergrid, God of Fright, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/5 legendary god at rare. She has Menace, and whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. And this is, like all the gods, a double-faced modal card. The other side is Tergrid's Lantern, which for 3 generic and a black is a legendary artifact at rare. You can tap it to have target player lose 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. And you can pay 3 generic and a black to untap Tergrid's Lantern. So both sides of this seems like they have their place. The god side really needs your deck to have the right composition to really take advantage. Not all black decks will have enough sacrifice or discard effects to actually utilize that part of her text, but she's a 5 mana 4/5 with Menace at worst, so she has a very reasonable floor. That means that even if you just have like 2 ways to take advantage of that text, she's going to be pretty nice. The Lantern side, on the other hand, needs a little bit less effort to be built around, but it's also kind of less powerful. Basically, it just pressures your opponent by making them give up a permanent or life, and that type of effect can sometimes be really bad, like if your opponent is significantly ahead of you and has plenty of creatures to sacrifice. But the good news is, if that is the case, you can just play Tergrid, who will be far better in that scenario. If you're well ahead of your opponent, the Lantern side will likely be better at helping you finish off your opponent, especially because if you have enough mana lying around, you can use the ability more than once a turn. So it is interesting to look at each side of this individually. The Tergrid half would probably be a B-. That would improve if you could really build around her, and the Lantern would probably be like a C or C+. But having both options together is all upside. You have a card that's a good creature, if that's what you need, and a card that's not a bad finisher, if that's what you need on the other side. Having 2 options on one card is all upside, and sometimes you'll build around Tergrid well enough for her to be crazy good. Overall, I think this makes Tergrid and her Lantern a B. Next up, it's Tergrid Shadow, which for 3 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. It says each player sacrifices 2 creatures, and you can foretell it for 2 generic and 2 black mana. I tend to not be a huge fan of symmetrical edict effects in limited. They have some really wide variance in terms of what they do. There will certainly be board states where it devastates your opponent and doesn't hurt you as much, and those will be situations where you cast it, but there will also be times where it hurts you more than your opponent, and you just won't be able to cast the card. It does have foretell, which means that maybe if the board isn't ideal, but you have the mana lying around, you can foretell it to pay less mana for it on a single turn further down the road. And yeah, there will be times where you just foretell this on turn 2, let your opponent play 2 creatures, and then cast a shadow on turn 4, which will be pretty nice. Also, obviously, it pairs amazingly with Tergrid. But there are just too many other situations where this won't be worth casting, and for that, I don't think I want to give this more than a C. Next up, it's Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire. Just a note, if you were expecting Valky, God of Lies here, we'll get to him when we look at multicolored cards later in the week, since he's technically a multicolored card, because it's a double-face modal card where one side costs both black and red. So, back to Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire. He's 2 generic and a black for a 2/3 legendary demon rogue at rare. It's got Death Touch and it has Boast. You can pay 1 generic and a black, and target player searches their library for a card, then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. So, a 3-mana 2/3 with Death Touch is probably already a C and is definitely at least a C-. Creatures that can trade with anything are nice all game long and limited. Then, Varragoth adds a pretty nice Boast effect. He lets you tutor up a card and put it on top of your library, and combining Boast with Death Touch is nice because a Death Touch creature is more likely to survive their attack than most other 2/3s, so getting to Boast more than once is a real possibility. Even if they do decide to block it, it's very likely their creature is also going to die, while you also get to improve your card quality. So with Boast on board, this is basically a 5-mana 2/3 with Death Touch that puts your best or most needed card on top of your library every time it attacks, and that's pretty nice. Keep in mind, putting a card on top is significantly worse than putting it into your hand. If it went to your hand, he'd be insane. But still, on top of your library is nice. It's going to give you very good card quality if you can do this more than once. I think overall, Varragoth is a B. Next up, it's Vengeful Reaper, who for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 angel cleric at uncommon. It has flying, Death Touch, and haste, and it has foretell for 1 generic and a black. This seems pretty good. It can represent a real threat as an attacker thanks to haste and flying, and once it can no longer attack effectively, Death Touch means it can still trade with anything. The foretell here is nice too, as paying for it in 2 payments will make it easier for you to double spell for the cards that care about that. This will fit nicely into any black deck, and I think you want to take it pretty highly, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Village Rites, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, and you draw 2 cards. This is a reprint and not one that I thought was particularly good last time we saw it. For this type of card to really be something special, you need for there to be a significant sacrifice or token sub-theme in black, and neither seems to be an overwhelming focus in this set, though the elf deck might do the best of taking advantage of this. It is nice that it's an instant, so you can sacrifice something after you declare a block or in response to an opponent's removal, but you're basically still just doing the same sort of thing that Tormenting Voice does. And that's not bad, it just isn't the kind of thing you will always have room for in your deck. Mostly, I think you'll play this if you're short on playables. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Way Down, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery, and as an additional cost to cast this spell, you exile a creature card from your graveyard, and target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. I like the cards in this set that have you exile a creature card from your graveyard to get some sort of effect or to pay for them. It allows them to design pretty efficient spells, since the setup on them won't be easy to achieve in the very early game, and that's what we have here. Obviously enough, if this was 1 black mana for -3/-3 at sorcery speed, we'd be talking about a solid B, maybe even a B+. Having to have a creature in the graveyard does mean this will often be dead in the early game, and sometimes even later than that. But all you have to do to make it work is trade with something, and if you're doing that and getting the additional value out of the creature by exiling it to pay for this, it'll feel pretty good. I do think being unable to cast this on like turn 2 or 3 in most cases keeps this from the premium label, but it is close. It has the efficiency for sure, it just won't be easy enough to cast to get there. I'm giving it a C+. And our last black card is Wither Crown, which for 1 generic and a black is an enchantment aura at common with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has base power 0 and has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life unless you sacrifice this creature. Well, this is a weird removal spell, so I have a hard time ever calling removal premium if it still allows whatever you put it on to block, and this does have that problem. But for most creatures, lowering their power to 0 is enough to make them hugely insignificant. It doesn't hurt that this makes your opponent lose life every turn or sacrifice the creature, at which point you do actually get the blocker out of the way. That said, most of the time you'll probably play this and it will enable new attacks for you, and your opponent will just use the creature to block it and it'll die, as it allows them to get something out of their weakened creature. So yeah, the fact that the creature can block is a bit of a bummer, and it certainly isn't premium. It does seem like a nice common for black, but not when you want to take early. I'm giving it a C+. Well, those are all the black cards in Kaldheim. Tomorrow I'll be back to look at all the red ones. If you want to buy any of the cards in this video, I have good news. You can pre-order Kaldheim at Card Kingdom. If you use my referral link in the description, you'll be taken right to their store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it, as that makes it more likely that other people will enjoy it too. If you want to stay up to date as my set review continues, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you need to catch up on the earlier videos in this review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.